Hi everyone. Let's combine chapters 9, 10, 11 into one lecture. It's going to be longer than the other videos here, but I want to take you consistently through the speech creation process, so I'm going to do it all at once. Don't forget to read chapters 9, 10, and 11. There are lots of good examples of what I'm talking about that will help you understand the organization and outlining process. Okay, let's get started. Remember this illustration? It helps you to see the three basic parts of a speech, but it does more than that. It also helps to determine approximately how big each part of the speech should be. The body is obviously the largest part. That's where you're going to have the vast majority of your information and by default the most words. The introduction isn't nearly as long as the body, but it has specific functions that you have to fulfill. The shortest part, the conclusion, is still a very important part of the speech. Don't think that because it's short, it's unimportant. It serves some critical functions as well. Each part of the speech is important, so you need to organize and outline them correctly for your speech to be effective. Remember, your upcoming demonstration speech needs to be between 4 and 7 minutes in length. What I like to tell my students is that they should shoot for the middle of that time. In other words, ideally, you should try to make your speech about 5.5 minutes in length. This will give you ample time on either side of that for things that you can't foresee, like speaking too fast and ending up a minute short, or having some issues with your visual and going a minute too long. This gives you a buffer zone, and it's rare that someone who takes my advice and creates a 5.5 minute speech ever goes either under or over time. So let's take that 5.5 minutes and see how much time we should devote to each part of the speech. The introduction should be around a minute or so. The body can be approximately 4 minutes in length, and the conclusion may be 30 seconds. Now, these obviously don't have to be exact, but that's a good rule of thumb. Okay, this is really important to remember. You've got to figure out your topic and at least a specific purpose statement before you start putting your speech together. If you don't do that, you won't know what you're talking about. Your central idea can come later as you're organizing the information. However, it's not a good idea to just start writing your speech from the beginning at this point. Before you put pen to paper and start writing the actual words of your speech, you need to determine its structure. And by that I mean how you need to organize the information in the biggest part of your speech, the body. You can't just ramble on. What you say has to be organized in a way that makes sense to your audience. You do this by creating what are called main points and supporting those main points with the information that you want to give us. Main points are the major ideas that are developed in the body of your speech. They are big, overarching ideas that your information is used to illustrate and support. For purposes of what we do in this class, you don't want too many main points. If people have to understand and remember too many important things, they're going to get confused and may not remember anything. So stick to between 2 and 5 main ideas. You need at least 2. But more than 5 main points is time-consuming. Remember, you only have about 4 minutes to go into detail in the body of your speech, so if you have too many main points, you're going to go over time. And as I said, your audience will get confused, which is the opposite of what you want to do. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This handout's also available in the module if you want to print it out and refer to it while you're organizing your speech. Let's say I want to do my demonstration speech on how to paint a room. I sit down and write a list of the steps involved in painting a room. By the time I'm done, I have 17 steps. I can't leave any of them out because they're important. However, there's no way my audience is going to understand, follow, and remember 17 individual items. But if I group those items into larger, logical, understandable, general steps, it's more likely that they're going to be able to remember them. On the left side of the page is my original list. On the right side is my nicely organized speech body. I've got 4 main points instead of 17 individual points. Each one of those steps is now what's called a subpoint. And each one of those 17 steps, if you look on the other side of the page, is still there, but they're listed underneath the main points, and they are now called subpoints. It makes sense. The first couple of steps were about gathering all the necessary material. Then the next series of steps was about preparing the room to be painted. Then some steps about the actual painting of the room. And finally, what needs to be done after painting to be able to enjoy the room again. I've gone from 17 steps to 4 main points. I hope you can see that the main points are more general, easier for the audience to grasp and remember, and will also help you, the speaker, to keep on track and explain them. There are many types of organizational patterns for speech bodies, and you can read about all of them in the chapter. But because we're focusing right now on your demonstration speech, I want to stick with and show you examples of 3 organizational patterns that lend themselves very nicely to demonstration speeches, and that's chronological, spatial, and topical. Let's look first at chronological. The How to Paint a Room speech we just looked at is organized chronologically, as is this example here. Chronological has to do with time, what happens first, what happens next, so on. Most demonstration speeches are chronological because when you're showing someone how to do something, there's usually a stepwise pattern involved. You can't skip around, things have to follow a certain order. This speech is an example of how to make wire-wrap jewelry. You've got to do that in a certain way. You can't leave anything out. As you can see, this speech has 4 main points. The first one is about gathering the materials. The second one is about how to start creating the first connector. The third main point is about putting beads on and creating another connector. And then the fourth one talks about how to keep connecting them together until you've created a jewelry piece. Now, I didn't put any of the actual steps or subpoints in here because I just want you to see the overall main point structure. Another pattern, not as common as chronological, but very helpful if you need it, is called the spatial organization pattern. This one has to do with directional patterns, where things are located in space. It could also be stepwise, like if you're given directions to someone, but sometimes it's not, as in this example. It doesn't really matter which of these main points would come first, second, or third. You can mix them up and start with the right side, for instance, but it's important that the items you're talking about be in a particular place. In this case, I decide to explain how to set a formal table by dividing the place setting into thirds, right, center, and left, and then describing what to put in each area and where to put them. As I said, it's not nearly as common as chronological, but if you're discussing where things go, it's critical. The last organizational pattern I'll discuss today is topical. The topical pattern is also very common. In fact, for all types of speeches, it's the most common one. In topical pattern, you're basically subdividing the topic into logical and consistent subtopics. Here's an example of a demonstration speech that's organized topically. This person wants to show 3 different ways to grow tomatoes. This list is neither chronological or spatial in nature, but they are each separate and distinct ways to grow tomatoes. So this lends itself to topical organization pattern. Now, not to confuse you, but I want you to think about the subpoints for each of these main points. Those are probably chronological in nature. Within each main point, there's going to be steps for each method of growing tomatoes. However, the main overall structure of the speech is still topical because it depends on how the main points are organized. So now I want you to think about your demonstration speech topic. What are you going to teach us? Does your topic lend itself to chronological, spatial, or topical organization? Think about the number of main points you're going to need, and that needs to be between 2 and 5, and exactly what those main points are going to be. No matter what organizational pattern you use, you'll need to remember a few things about main points. They should be separate parts of the topic. Don't mix them up together. Keep them consistent and logical. Balance the time you devote to each main point. What I mean by that is, if you have 3 main points and 4 minutes to devote to the entire body of your speech, then you're looking at about 1 minute and 20 seconds for each main point. Again, that's approximate, and they don't all have to be exactly the same length. But if you're spending 3 minutes on the first point, 30 seconds on the second point, and 1 minute on the third point, there's probably something not quite right there. You might have information in the first point that needs to be in its own main point, or you might have only 2 main points and the last 2 could be combined. If you're not sure, you can certainly ask me to look at it. But as I said, they need to be logical and make sense as they flow from one idea to the next. You're trying to help your audience understand, not confuse them. So once you've figured out the general structure of the body of your speech, now you don't have to figure out the exact wording yet, but you do need to know the structure. Then you can start looking at the introduction. An introduction is a critical part of your speech because it gives the audience a reason to listen to the speech as well as sets them up for what they're going to hear in the body of the speech. Any good introduction serves 4 important functions. First, you need to get the audience's attention. It needs to be done immediately because if people don't hear something that catches their attention quickly, they're going to lose interest and their minds will start to wander. Second, you need to make the topic understandable and important to them somehow. Show them why it's relevant enough for them to listen to. Third, you need to establish your credibility as a speaker on the topic. Tell them why you are the person to speak to them about it. Let them know you have information or experience about it that makes you qualified to speak on it and that you have their best interests in mind. And finally, you need to tell them briefly what the main points are so they're going to be familiar with them as you take them through the body of the speech. So let's look at each of these functions in a little more detail. First thing to do is to gain the audience's attention. There are lots of good ways to do that. Here are a few. You can start by immediately relating the topic to the audience. Make it about them somehow. Maybe start with a hypothetical example with the audience members as the star. If you're giving a speech about how to make a cheesecake, you could start by saying, "It's your sister's birthday. You don't have a lot of money to get her a present, but you know she loves dessert. Imagine how her eyes would light up when you present her with a dessert that you made yourself. The best gifts come from the heart." Or you could start with some kind of startling statement. Maybe you're giving a speech about how to keep your heart healthy. You find a statistic about the percentage of people who have heart attacks. You could start with something like, "All of us in this room are living with a time bomb in our chests. It's our heart. In fact, according to the Heart Foundation, heart disease is the #1 killer of all Americans. None of us is immune." Another thing you might want to do is arouse curiosity by not coming right out and telling us what you're talking about and letting us wonder instead. But don't let us wonder for too long. What you're saying needs to clearly lead into revealing your topic. Here's a good introduction that keeps you guessing. It's dark and you're being chased by someone. You try to run, but you're so afraid that your feet won't move. They're frozen. When you finally find the strength to run, it seems as if you are running through jello. Whoever it is right behind you. You turn to see the figure reaching out to grab you. And then you wake up in your bed. Shaking and breathing hard, you realize you just woke up from a nightmare. Boy, are you relieved. The person leads us to the topic of nightmares instead of just blurting out that they're going to talk about nightmares. Questions are very popular ways to start speeches because they're easy. But there are pitfalls associated with using them, so be careful. You can ask direct questions of your audience like, "How many of you have gotten a traffic ticket in the past year?" to begin a speech about how to talk your way out of a traffic ticket. That will certainly get their attention, but you need to understand that you could get any number of different reactions to that question. Maybe people will raise their hands, maybe everyone will just stare blankly at you, maybe someone will blurt out their experience getting a ticket, you just don't know. So you have to be prepared for anything and ready to respond to whatever feedback you get from the audience and move it back to your speech. Rhetorical questions that generally don't require an answer might be better. Just don't hesitate too long after you ask it, or the audience will think that they're supposed to respond. In the painting a room speech that I use as an example, I begin by asking, "What's the one thing you can do to any room that will make the biggest difference with the least expense?" Now, I'm not asking that question to get a response from the audience, just to get them to think about the topic. Then I immediately answer my own question with, "If you said painting, you're absolutely right." Another thing you need to consider is there a better opener to use instead of a question? If you're giving a speech about how to give a dog a bath, starting with, "Who here has a dog?" isn't really a very good way to pull people into the speech. Don't start with a question just because it's easy, because an ineffective question comes off as kind of lame. Quotations are sometimes a good way to start a speech, but you have to make sure that, number one, you tell us who said it, and number two, it leads nicely into a discussion of your topic and isn't just vaguely related to what you're talking about. Also, if you're going to use a quote to start a speech, it's better to use one from a recognizable source than someone with whom the audience is unfamiliar. For instance, if your speech is about how to determine what clothing style suits you best, you might want to start by saying, "The iconic and legendary designer Coco Chanel once said, Fashion fades, only style remains the same. That's a great way to lead into that topic. And finally, telling a story as your opening statement can be very effective. Humans are storytellers by nature. We're also very attuned to stories and examples as they help us to relate to the topic. It can be a personal story or a story you find in your research, but remember that you don't have a lot of time to tell a long, drawn-out story. You need to get to the point fairly quickly. For instance, if you're going to give a speech about how to change a flat tire, you could start with a story about your first experience with a flat tire. Something like, "It was a cold and windy December night. I was 16, driving home alone on my way from my friend's house, when I felt my car lurch to the side. I managed to keep control, steer it onto the side of the road, and stop. I got out and looked, and sure enough, my right front tire was shredded. I got back into the car and put on my hazard lights, grabbed my phone to call my dad. My phone was dead. I was stranded, and I had no idea how to change a tire. Fortunately for me, a Good Samaritan came along and helped me. But that night, I promised myself I would learn how to change a tire so I'd never feel so helpless again." So as you can see, there are many effective ways to begin a speech. What you choose will depend on your topic and how you want to approach it. Once you've got our attention, you need to reveal the topic of your speech. Make sure you don't do this first thing. Don't start your speech by saying, "Today I'm going to talk about whatever." Just blurting out your topic at the beginning isn't particularly interesting, so wait until after your attention getter to tell us. Sometimes by the end of the attention getter, it's obvious what your topic is, but you should still tell us anyway. And don't forget to tell us. That's happened before in speeches, and it leaves the audience trying to guess what exactly the speaker's topic is. You might also need to point out why the topic is important to your audience. Now, it doesn't have to be of earth-shattering importance. For instance, how truly important is it that your audience needs to know how to make a cheesecake? But you can come up with a reason for them to want to hear what you have to say about it. You could say something like, "Cheesecake is one of the most popular desserts out there and would really make your next dinner party something special." Once you've gained the audience's attention and revealed the topic and its importance to them, then you need to let them know why they should listen to you. Establishing credibility is an important step and one you shouldn't skip. You need to briefly tell them your interest, knowledge, and experience with the topic. Why would you pick a topic for a speech that you don't care about and that you don't know anything about? You wouldn't. So tell us why this topic is of interest to you and what you know about it. For the cheesecake speech, if your mom always made cheesecake and she's the one that gave you her recipe, tell us that. You don't have to be a recognized expert on a topic to give an effective speech about it. You just have to have some connection to the topic via interest, knowledge, or experience. And don't be shy about telling us what your connection is. We need to hear it so we can trust that you're giving us the best information about that topic. Finally, before you move from your introduction into the body of your speech, you need to tell us what you're going to tell us. In other words, you need to preview by telling us what you want us to learn and what the main points are going to be. This is a critical step because it helps to let the audience know that you're ready to begin the main portion, the body of the speech. Here's an example from How to Paint a Room. So today I'll be showing you how to paint a room. I'll show you how to choose the right materials, prepare the room for painting, effective painting techniques, and how to clean up afterwards. So the goal is to show you how to paint the room, and the 4 main points are the choosing materials, preparing the room, painting the room, and cleaning up. Now I've set the audience up for what's going to happen next, and I'm ready to move into the body of the speech. So now you know the 4 functions of a good introduction. Keep these hints in mind as you're preparing yours. Be concise. One of the most common mistakes that new speakers make is that their introductions are way too long. They get all caught up in their story or explaining the topic or go into too much detail about their connection to the topic and end up with a 4-minute introduction. At that point, it's almost certain you're going to go over the time limit. Remember, an introduction for a 4 to 7 minute speech should be about a minute long. Also, if you're doing research for a speech, it may not be necessary for the demonstration speech, but certainly for the other speeches. You might find good stories, examples, or statistics that you could consider using somewhere in the introduction. Be creative, use your imagination, use humor, or touch our emotions. These things help you relate to the audience. Don't start putting the introduction together until you've decided on how you're going to organize the body of the speech. If you don't know what the main points are, you really can't set up an effective introduction anyway. But once the body is organized, then you can write your introduction. It's a good idea to work it out in detail to make sure you're fulfilling all 4 functions. Let's move on to conclusions. Remember that I said that the conclusion was the shortest part of your speech, probably around 30 seconds for a 4 to 7 minute speech. That doesn't mean it's unimportant though. It's the very last thing that the audience hears from you, and you want it to be something that they remember. A conclusion generally serves 2 purposes: to let the audience know the speech is almost over, which, trust me, they appreciate. There's nothing quite so awkward as a speaker who stops abruptly without having given any hint that they're concluding. The audience just sits there quietly confused, thinking, is she finished or not? And then when they finally figure it out, they'll half-heartedly applaud. And the other function of a conclusion is to reinforce the central idea in the minds of the audience, helping them to remember the whole point of the speech. One thing you absolutely must do is summarize. Just as you have to preview your main points in the introduction, you also have to remind us again in the conclusion of what the main points were to help us remember. You probably shouldn't say them exactly the same way you did in the preview. Say them a bit differently, but remind us generally of what they were. Then you need to have a good, solid concluding statement. One that, simply put, sounds like you're finished when you're done saying it. Some effective ideas include ending with a quotation. Again, make sure it's appropriate and tell us who said it. For instance, to end the cheesecake speech, you could say, "So don't be afraid to give this recipe a try. You won't be sorry. As Martha Stewart says, cheesecake is always a good idea." You can make what the book calls a dramatic statement. I don't think that means to act all dramatic or tragic or anything like that. It means to end with a statement that causes the audience to think about the topic. Or you could do what's called a full circle ending, where you refer back to something you said in the introduction. For instance, for the how to change a tire speech, you might end with, "Now that you know the basics of changing a tire, I hope you take the time to practice your new skills. That way, you won't end up stranded on the road in the middle of the night like I was. You'll know exactly what to do, and that will keep you safe." Here's some tips to keep in mind when you're writing your conclusion. Remember that the conclusion is the shortest part of your speech. It really shouldn't be more than 30 to 45 seconds long for a speech in this class. The 2 things you must do are summarize your main points and have a clear, effective closing statement. So plan that out. Know what you're going to say. I've seen speakers who obviously didn't take much time to plan their conclusion, get to the end of the speech, and then just keep talking in circles because they realize they have no idea how they're going to finish it. I can see it in their eyes that they realize they should have taken the conclusion seriously. Remember, it's short, but it's just as important as the other parts of your speech. And don't end with such lame statements as, "Well, I guess that's it," or "Okay then, that's all." Please do your best to conclude well. If you have the fear that after you say your closing statement, the audience still won't know you're done, you can certainly end with a "thank you." That's a definite sign that you're done, but if you have a strong concluding statement, you may not need it. It's up to you. Okay, we've talked about organizing the body, introduction, and conclusion of your speech. Now, let's discuss creating your outline and speaking notes. The book refers to the outline as the preparation outline, but I just call it an outline. This is the part where you put the actual speech together in detail from start to finish. But you're not writing out a manuscript. You're putting it together in outline format, even though it's mostly full sentences. Not totally, but mostly. This is not the thing you're going to be speaking from when you're giving the speech. Those are speaking notes, and we're going to talk about those later. This is your ideal speech written in outline format. Some students wonder why they can't just write out their speech as a manuscript. Well, once you're done with my class, you can do anything you want. But in this class, it's my job to teach you how to speak most effectively, and that involves organization and knowing exactly what goes where in your speech. The best way to make sure you're fulfilling all the functions of an introduction, sticking to the main ideas and supporting material, and ending effectively is to organize your information in outline format. You need structure. You need to make sure you're keeping to the time restrictions. You need to stay on track. This is the best way to do that. In these modules, you'll find examples of outlines for each kind of speech that we do. You're certainly free to use them as templates for your own outlines, but no matter what kind of speech you're doing, when you create your outlines, you have to include certain things as shown on this list. Your name, the topic, specific purpose statement, central idea, those all have to be written out and labeled. In fact, each main part of the speech should be labeled, and each function of the introduction and conclusion should be labeled. In the body, you're going to need to follow the correct symbolization format, which I'll show you shortly. While not everything in the outline needs to be written out in full sentences, it's a good idea to write out main points and most subpoints as sentences. You'll need to create and label transitions and attach a bibliography if one's required. It's not for the demonstration speech, but you're going to need one for the persuasive and motivated sequence speeches. Now, on the last slide, I said you'd need to create and label transitions. What are those? Transitions are a form of connective, and connectives are words and phrases that help tie things together and make your ideas clearer and more understandable to your audience. Transitions are used between the main parts of your speech to help your ideas flow smoothly from one idea to the next. If you don't use them, it will seem like you're just jumping from idea to idea without connecting them together, and that can be confusing to the audience. The places where you're going to need transitions are between the first and second main points, between the second and third main points, if you have more than 3, between each one of those, between the third and fourth main points, and between the fourth and fifth, if you have a fifth main point, and between the last main point and your conclusion. Here are transitions that I might use when putting together my speech about how to create wire-wrap jewelry. As you can see, they mention what I just talked about and what I'm going to talk about next. So between the first and second main points, once I'm done with the material in the first main point, I would say something like, now that we've got all the proper materials, let's see how to create the first loop. Between the second and third main points, I would say, now that the first loop's been created, let's see how to create and link the wrapped bead. Between the third and fourth main point, I could say something like, now that you know how to link wrapped beads together, let's see what kind of things you can create with them. And between the fourth main point leading into the conclusion, I would say something like, as you can see, making jewelry is fun and easy. Let's review what we learned today. The book also gives some really good examples of transitions, so make sure you look at those. The body of the speech needs to conform to this specific format. The main points have to be identified by Roman numerals. All subpoints should be labeled as capital letters, and any sub-subpoints, which are breakdowns of information related to your subpoints, should be identified with regular numbers. It's unlikely that you would need to break down information more than those 3 levels, but if you do, those are called sub-subpoints, and they're identified with small letters. It's easier to do than to remember what they're called. Also, as you can see, the main points are out at the margin. Subpoints are indented 1 tab in. Don't line everything up at the margin. The whole point of outlining is so you and I can see the overall structure of your speech, and you can't do that if it looks all the same. So here's what I don't want you to do. As you can see, all of the information is lined up on the margin, but it just looks like a big long list of stuff. It's difficult to tell what the main points are, or you simply can't see the structure of your speech. This is the way it needs to look. Because it's formatted and indented correctly, it's easy to distinguish the main point from the more detailed sub and sub-sub points. The structure of the main point is easy to see, and this is what you're going for. Like I said before, there are examples of outlines in the modules so you can see what they should look like. The book also has examples and a more detailed explanation of creating outlines that you should definitely read. Once your outline is finished, you will need to create a set of speaking notes that you're going to use to deliver the speech. Remember, your preparation outline is just that. You use it to prepare the speech, not to deliver it. Why? Because it's too tempting to just read it, and you want to connect with the audience while you're giving them this information. That requires good eye contact, which you can't have if your nose is stuck in your outline. You're going to need to purchase some note cards. Get the bigger ones, like 4x6, not the 3x5 ones, so you can write bigger and more legibly on them. You're not going to transfer every word from your outline to your notes. You want to decide which words are going to best help you remember the ideas you want to express. Extemporaneous speaking doesn't mean memorizing or reading every word. It means getting the ideas across. So don't be worried that you're not going to remember the exact wording of your outline. It's about the idea, not the exact wording of that idea. But don't put so few words in your notes that you can't even remember what your idea was. Also, you need to keep the same formatting as you created in your outline. You still need to be able to see your speech structure. So don't just put words on the cards. Even bullet points won't necessarily help you. Keep the same number-letter format, just use less words. There's an example of speaking notes based on the outline example in the module, so you can see how much and what kind of information you should transfer from the outline to the notes. And create those notes well before you're scheduled to present the speech. You're going to need time to practice with them. I've seen students desperately writing out notes right before class starts on speech day. There's no way you can give an effective speech with notes if you haven't even practiced with them. In conclusion, a well-organized, outlined, and practiced speech is far more likely to get you a good grade than a haphazard, quickly thrown together one will. Look at the handouts included in this module if you need examples, and let me know if I can help you organize your speech. This is the end of the lecture on chapters 9, 10, and 11.